Right, we shall begin. So thank you for your time. This session is going to be about understanding alcohol and its markers in forensic samples, because it is quite different to drugs. I don't know if you've listened to any of our webinars regarding drugs, but this one is more specific to alcohol because most or a lot of your cases will probably involve both drugs and alcohol. So we just wanted to cover this, hopefully to help you understand what to look for and what to instruct for if you're instructing for alcohol, whether it's on its own or whether it's part of a drug test as well. So we've got a 1 hour session. That's me. You may have met me or heard me speak before. So thank you for your time. We've got a little bit to get through. So I'll give you a bit of a background. What sample types you might want to consider, what the influencing factors will be on those sample types, cover a little bit about the cut-offs, the Society of Hair Testing cut-offs that are used in the industry, and then we'll look at what best practice looks like, and then we'll just do a bit of a recap and a summary, and we'll close. So, you may have instructed for alcohol previously, or it might be something that you're thinking about, but there are a number of areas that it can support you. And it usually is a key component of what it is that you're trying to understand. Because I suppose part of what you're trying to understand is the parent or the parents, are they able to effectively parent the child without there being a safeguarding issue? And often alcohol will play a part in that. You might be working in other areas where you're seeing people in the community, and part of your role when you visit them is to make sure that they are clean and they are not under any influences. So one of the areas you can look for is there or are there any substances present in the sample? Now, there's different samples we can take, we'll cover that, but that's specifically sometimes what you want to know. Is there anything there? Is there anything present in there? So if you're looking for someone that needs to abstain from alcohol, then part of your screening regime is, have they consumed any alcohol? Is there anything present in that sample? Sometimes you're not really looking for abstinence, you might be looking for a reduction in the use of alcohol. So what you might also want to consider is what levels are detected, because parents can parent a child and they can be consuming alcohol at the same time. You want to know, is that at such a level where it may present a safeguarding issue or an issue for you if you have to visit them in the field. So therefore we'd look at, is it abstinence or is there moderate use? Is there excessive use, etc.? You might also want to consider when they are consuming alcohol, what time periods, is it constantly over 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, or is it just infrequent periodic usage? So therefore you want to look at patterns of alcohol consumption. Do they binge every weekend, or are they consistently, maybe drinking a bottle of vodka every night, if you can do that. So there's various areas that alcohol markers can help and support you. And this has been around for a long time. Alcohol testing has been around probably longer than drugs in many instances, but particularly within family for more than 30 years now. So it's an evolving science, as everything is, but one thing you want to try and understand as part of your assessment is, are they consuming alcohol excessively? But you need to sort of bear this in mind. You need to be sort of careful with this analysis. So for instance, excessive, if you look at what the World Health Organization, how they define consumption, they see excessive as when consumption exceeds 7.5 units of alcohol in a single drinking event. So you can see from that little graphic, the bottom right, 7.5 units looks like. So you've got sort of 3.5 pints of beer, 4 glasses of wine, or 4 glasses of double spirit. So it's not a massive amount. You don't have to be consuming a massive amount of alcohol for the World Health Organization to define it as excessive. So chronic excessive, obviously chronic is when something exists for a longer period. Excessive might be a one episode, a binge episode where they have excessively consumed more than 7.5 units. If it's chronic, it's longer term, it's more consistent, and they define this as when consumption exceeds around about 14 units a week over extended periods, therefore sort of 60. If they're getting up to 60 units, then that sort of becomes chronic excessive. But just a word of caution about these definitions. WHO's guidance really looks at consumption levels that may have a long-term impact on the client's health. So not really whether the person is intoxicated from this level of consumption, because people's tolerance to alcohol is totally different. You know, some people can drink what would seem to be large volumes of alcohol and seem to function quite normally, whereas others can drink much smaller levels and it really affects them in a negative way. So you just need to bear in mind that when you're looking at excessive and chronic excessive, you also need to factor in what you know about the client and what you know about their circumstances. So just be aware that this guidance does not relate to levels that induce intoxication, incapacitation, and or adverse behavior. So again, going back to what you're trying to understand, is there a risk to a child or is there a risk to yourself? Just be aware that these baseline levels of excessive and chronic excessive may help, but may not give you a complete definitive answer. So when we testing for alcohol, we're not actually looking for alcohol, weirdly. We're actually looking for what's called the biomarkers of alcohol, and this is what's produced in the body, which is generally in response to you consuming alcohol. So consumed alcohol is absorbed into the bloodstream like anything is that you would ingest, and it gets transported around the body and it gets metabolized. So it breaks down as it goes through the body to various different compounds, which for the purpose of this we'll call sort of biomarkers. Now, because your body sees alcohol as effectively as a poison, as a toxin, it wants to get rid of it as quickly as it can, which is why certain sample types have a very small window of detection. So if you're using either blood or urine or saliva, because that is part of the excretion method, the way the body gets rid of this toxin, the windows of detection are very small. Sometimes you're talking hours, sometimes you might be talking days. So if you're looking for understanding a longer period of, say, a month, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, then you really don't want to be using urine, saliva, blood. It's very invasive for a start. So the best way to do this is obviously a hair strand test or a nail test. So this doesn't necessarily relate to what's been excreted. This relates to what you've consumed, what ends up in your blood system, and then what ends up being locked into your hair follicle or your nails as they grow. And that's how we can identify alcohol biomarkers. So we can collect samples from multiple sources, and all these will give you varying levels of useful information. So it's important to know what sample types are available for you and what that actually means in terms of what that's going to give you from a balance of probabilities point of view. So got a couple of definitions here. Don't expect you to remember the actual the long word. So for instance, PEth is phosphatidyl ethanol. Now PEth is quite new. It's only been around for about 5 or 6 years, and it's basically a very, very good sample. It's very stable, and it's collected via a finger prick of blood. So it's a very easy sample to collect, not invasive at all. And it's only formed in the presence of ethanol, which is essentially alcohol, via the action of phospholipase D, or PLD as it's said. So it accumulates in the blood and it's removed slowly. So this is a good biomarker. We'll get into this as we go through the slides, but this can give you a really good indication and a slightly longer window of detection. Sometimes it can be up to 4 weeks worth of history if you're looking at a PEth sample. So that's a good medium to work with. Now, ETG, you might be familiar with the term ETG if you have instructed for alcohol previously. ETG is ethyl glucuronide, ETG, and it's basically formed in either hair or nails, sometimes urine as well. And it's the metabolite again of ethanol, which is formed in the body by glucuronidation following exposure to ethanol. So again, it's produced when ethanol or alcohol is consumed, so usually from drinking an alcoholic beverage. It's used as a biomarker to test for ethanol use and to monitor alcohol abstinence. So ETG is quite good at being able to demonstrate abstinence from alcohol, and ETG works well. ETG can give you a longer window, especially in hair and nails, and it works well combined with PEth. So PEth is a shorter window, but PEth is blood, ETG is a different medium. So combining those two together can work really well. There are some limitations with ETG, which we'll go into. So one other option to consider is what's called ETPA, ethyl palmitate. So this, don't expect you to remember this, is a long fatty chain acid ethyl ester resulting from the formal condensation of the carboxy group of palmic acid within the hydroxy group of ethanol. Bit of a mouthful, but again, this is found in hair and can be present as a result of consuming ethanol or alcohol. It's a little bit more stable in certain instances than ETG is. So it could, depending on the sample, if you're using hair, for instance, then ETG might not always be the best medium to use. ETPA, therefore, is another alternative. So what can we use to collect these samples? So we can collect a hair sample, and a hair sample can contain ETG and both ETPA. If we're collecting a finger prick of blood, we will be analysing this for PEth. If we are collecting urine, again we can look for ETG in urine. Sweat can also be analysed. Sweat's a little bit of a difficult medium to work with, and the sweat patches are quite new, so I'm not really going to cover that in this presentation. But I will cover what has historically been used a lot, which is whole blood or venipuncture blood. And you might have instructed previously for things like LFTs, liver function tests, MCVs, and CDT results. So I'll go into what those mean and how you can interpret results based on the samples that we would collect from that. And then, of course, you've got breath. So there is a breathalyzers that can be used. Again, this is a very short window of detection, so these may work better if you're visiting a home and you need to know straight away if someone is presenting issues relating to alcohol. There's also scram bracelets as well, which we cover off slightly in this presentation, but you might be familiar with the scram bracelets, which is attached to the ankles, and they're more of a longer term analysis of the use of alcohol. So there's a number of different samples that you can instruct that we can collect. You need to understand what we term as these windows of detection. How long does alcohol or the alcohol biomarkers remain in that sample? And as you can see from this graphic, it's a very, very short window of detection for things like blood, which is whole blood effectively, breath, as in a breathalyzer, urine, again, because, and sweat, urine, sweat, breath, and in many ways blood, are the way that the body gets rid of the toxin that you're ingesting, sees it as a poison, wants to get rid of it quickly. So these have a short window of detection, generally up to about 16 hours. Obviously, PEth is different. Even though it is blood, it's a very stable and a good medium to give you a longer window of detection. So PEth can give you analysis and a history from about 4 days to about 4 weeks. So that, can work much better for you if you need to understand. Not necessarily, obviously, PEth won't tell you immediately what's going on with that particular person if you're coming face to face with them. But if you need to start to understand the history, PEth is very good, as is ETG and ETPA, because they're contained in hair, which locks in from blood and from sebum and sometimes sweat. It locks in what the body's been ingesting and what the body's been exposed to. So again, you can get, depending on the length of hair, up to 1 to 9 months, or even longer if you've got longer hair. And nails is similar as well, 3 to 12 months, depending on the size of the nail bed. So again, these are great for if you want to know someone's history over, let's say, a period of 3 months or 6 months. Those are great samples to instruct for. So periods less than a month. So again, sometimes this may not be relevant for anyone that wants to understand the history of a parent and what it is that they're presenting with. But in many cases, sometimes you want to know sooner than that. So finger prick, blood PEth is ideal, say up to about 4 weeks. Urine has a shorter window of detection. Sweat can be a bit complicated in terms of it working and understand the results. I think there needs to be a bit more work done on that. And then I'll cover off venipuncture blood sample. So this is where you draw a vial of blood from the arm. So the sample collectors that are doing this obviously need to be properly trained in phlebotomy to collect whole blood samples. And then obviously you've got breath, where you would generally have a breathalyzer with you, and you would ask someone to blow into that breathalyzer, and that would give you a reading. It's important to bear in mind that with things like urine and breath, these are what's called presumptive positives. So if you've ever been stopped by the police and breathalyzed, you will know that if it produces what's called a presumptive positive, they will take you back to the station. They will take a blood sample and that will be analysed. Same with urine. You would treat that as a presumptive positive, and you generally wouldn't make decisions based on a positive urine pot sample. You would generally have to get that confirmed by sending it off to a laboratory. So let's have a look at PEth. So this is a direct metabolite of alcohol, and it can provide information from 1 to 2 days of drinking and up to about 4 weeks, depending on the history of consumption, which we'll go into in a second. So it's only produced in the body when ethanol is present, or therefore when alcohol has been consumed. It circulates in the blood, so therefore its presence in the blood when it's collected. And there is, at this point, no evidence of any external influences decreasing or increasing the results you would expect to see from PEth. So it's a very stable medium, easy to collect, not invasive really in any way, and it does produce a good set of results for you. There is some variability, obviously. There is variability between individuals, which I'll go into in a second. You need to understand how quickly PEth is formed in the body, and then how quickly the person clears PEth from the body, because everyone's metabolism is different, and we need to understand what the sort of half-life reduction of PEth is to get an understanding of what that means in terms of a result. And this sort of gives you an example. It's quite a crude example, but it sort of gets the point across. If you've got 2 people, and individual A will process and clear PEth a lot quicker, they would generally have what's called a 4-day half-life. So every 4 days, the level of PEth in the blood is halved until it's reduced, until it's gone completely. So you can see that individual A reduces their levels of PEth every 4 days, and as you can see from the blue dots in the vial on the left, after day 14, it's pretty much gone. Level of PEth has gone. Individual B, their body is completely different, metabolism slightly different. They don't get rid of PEth nearly as quickly as individual A. They have what's called a 14-day half-life. So every 14 days, their levels of PEth would diminished by half. So, and you can see the dramatic difference as we go through to day 4, day 6, and day 14. If you look at day 6 for individual B compared to day 6 for individual A, there's a massive difference in the levels of PEth within the bloodstream, and also on day 14 as well. There's a lot more PEth created or still existing in individual B. So all the labs have to be mindful of this, and we are, but you would just check with them if you're instructing for PEth that they understand that the PEth half-life and they have an understanding of the person that they are collecting the sample from. So you can see what that looks like in graph form. You will see that donor 1, who was individual A, there's a much steeper reduction. The levels drop quite significantly and quite quickly. And donor 2, who was individual B, they have a more gradual curve, which is fine, but until you get to doing the analysis and you need to understand, let's say you're collecting a sample of PEth on day 14, for instance, then you would see that individual A or donor 1 would be very low at that period, whereas individual 2 would be much higher. So we have to bear this in mind, and this has to be understood in terms of the information that comes back to you. And we understand this, and if you've seen reports from FTS, you will see how this is explained. But if they're constantly consuming alcohol, then this would look totally different, because you wouldn't, this is a one isolated incident. Let's say they went 2 weeks ago, they went on a massive binge over the weekend and they haven't drank since. This is what it would look like. But if somebody's drinking consistently, then that would obviously show up totally different in PEth. You'd have a different line, and it would give you a particular level based on what the sort of average consumption is over the periods that you're looking at. So for blood, there's other, what we would term as less specific alcohol markers. They've been around longer than PEth, a lot longer than PEth. And you'll see in many court orders, if you've seen the court orders for alcohol instruction, you'll see that they would generally, if they're looking for blood, they would generally specify CDT, MCV, and LFT testing. So this is whole blood, and the blood is analysed for these specific markers. So CDT is what's termed as carbohydrates deficient transferrin, and there's low percentages of it in blood, and in 95% of cases it can indicate excessive alcohol consumption over a period of about 2 to 3 weeks prior to when the sample was collected. So again, you would use that in conjunction with something else like PEth and maybe hair as well, rather than just in isolation using CDT, because it it can give you varying results. MCV is mean corpuscular volume, and again this looks at if your red blood cells are enlarged, and if they are, this will elevate your MCV levels in about 4% of adults, so 60% likely alcohol related. So again, it's a little bit, it can give you an indication, but you've just got to be aware of potentially what the limitations are with these markers. Raised vitamin B12 or vitamin B12 deficiency can affect MCV and liver disease and things like that. So again, LFT is basically a liver function test. So you would sometimes go to your GP to see how well your liver's performing. So an LFT test, really a liver function test, does what it says on the tin. It's basically a marker which is raised if the liver is damaged. Now that might not be the case if you're an infrequent drinker, or you binge every now and again, or you're quite young. Then your liver is unlikely to be damaged, so it's unlikely to have a raised LFT marker. So again, it's how relevant this is going to be. You might ask to instruct for this evidence, But again, how useful is that going to be to you in terms of, what levels of alcohol they are consuming and whether they're fit to parent the child that they're looking after? So just bear that in mind. If you're dealing with people that maybe are alcoholics or are older, then LFT might become more prominent because there may be likely damage to the liver. So again, this would tell you that. So in certain circumstances, it can be useful, but just bear in mind the limitations of these markers when you're instructing for them. So SCRAM, you might be familiar with SCRAM, Secure Continuous Remote Alcohol Monitoring. This started off in America for drink driving, and it was seen that it could be effective in sort of family court cases as well, in some cases. So it does work like a breathalyzer. You attach it to the donor's ankle, it stays on there all the time, and it provides 24/7 monitoring of what's called transdermal alcohol, which is sweat. It's sweat coming through your body. So if you're consuming a lot of alcohol, that will start to come through as sweat again. Your body wants to get rid of it quickly. It excretes the toxin through your sweat glands, and the SCRAM bracelet picks that up. So it will pick up a reading generally every 30 minutes. And it's a great piece of kit, but again, you've got to understand what this is giving you and what you are trying to establish. These work better if you're working with a client where they have to abstain from alcohol. So it will continuously read a reading, and if it works off a cutoff, a bit like a breathalyzer does, it will obviously show you that no alcohol above the cutoff has been consumed. You can consume relatively low volumes of alcohol relatively frequently to stay below the cutoff level. So in a lot of cases, if you're trying to establish complete abstinence, it might not give you what you're looking for. If you have someone that frequently goes out and binges alcohol, then they work really well for that. So if you've got somebody that's going out every weekend, a couple of times a week, and having a lot to drink, then a SCRAM bracelet will tell you that immediately. So in that instance, they work great. But again, just bear them in mind in terms of what it is that you're trying to establish and whether a SCRAM bracelet is the best option to give you that information. So if you're looking for a longer history, longer than a month, say 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, then hair and nails are your best option. Again, you combine this. You might combine it with whole blood. You might combine it with PEth. It works really well in those instances. So hair, you can get ETG and ETPA, and nails will give you ETG readings as well. So if you've seen webinars previously about drug testing, you'll see how effective hair can be in terms of storing that information as the body metabolizes these markers, these biomarkers, and they go around your body in your blood system and your sebum. They get transported into your hair follicle and they get locked in place. So we can collect a hair sample depending on the length of it. Unlike drugs, hair for alcohol is not necessarily segmented into monthly segments. When we segment it for alcohol, it's generally a 3-month look, a 3-month window. So if there's long enough, you have 3 segments. Segment 1 is the first 3 months, segment 2 is the second, and segment 3 is the third 3 months. So again, just bear in mind that when you're looking at hair for alcohol, it won't be necessarily segmented month on month. We can do it, it's just a lot more expensive, and it's whether that would give you the additional information over and above what you would get from the standard process of segmenting it into 3-month length. So again, just bear that in mind, but it also gives you the opportunity to understand, because as part of what we do a client questionnaire and we interview the client, and if they self-report what they tell us they are consuming, and if that's honest, then that will come through in the levels within hair, the ETG and ETPA. Nails pretty similar as well. Problem you've got with hair is that sometimes it can be adulterated. So you might get a situation where somebody's dyed the hair or bleached the hair or been using straighteners for a long time. That can affect the levels, particularly of ETG in hair. So again, it's always an option to consider nail testing as a fallback, or if you can't get a hair sample at all, if they've shaved the head, then nail testing is a brilliant way of getting the information that you need. It works similar to hair. You can see there from the graphic on the left. Your nail bed is fed by your blood supply all the way through until it reaches the end. So the bit that we cut off at the end, the white bit, is an average of what's happened depending on the length of that nail bed. So as you saw earlier when we were saying nails will give you sort of 4 to 12 months, depends on the size of the nail bed. So your small little finger nail or your small toenail probably gives you about 4 months, but your big thumbnail or your big toenail is much bigger and therefore gives you a longer window. So sometimes up to 12 months, maybe longer. But again, bear in mind it's only an average, so we can't segment a nail. So the nail testing that we do will give you an average of what alcohol biomarkers are contained in that sample over the period relating to the size of the nail. So ETG builds up in the germinal matrix and along the nail bed. So you can see it's fed by the blood and it builds up in the nail bed. It becomes trapped in the keratin fibers of the nail. So that's how we can, it's a bit like your hair follicle. A lot of drugs bind to melanin in your hair. ETG will attach itself to the keratin fibers of nails. So it's a great sample for us to use and for us to analyze. Periods are calculated by the length of the nail bed. And as I've said there, you generally get 3 to 9 months or sometimes 5 to 16 months if you've got big hands or big feet with big nails. So the primary biomarker is ETG. And again, this is a direct metabolite of alcohol, so it's great in that respect. It gets incorporated into the hair and nails, and increasing alcohol consumption increases ETG levels. So on the face of it, it's a great sample to work with. And again, combined with something else like PEth, it can work really well. What you have to consider is that it is a little bit unstable in hair. ETG is readily removed from hair by permanent dyes, bleach, and even washing and conditioning your hair regularly. So these will progressively reduce ETG levels, particularly when hair is damaged from use of heat treatment, so your straighteners, or excessive UV light exposure if they've been on sunbeds a lot, and that will have an effect on ETG. So if you're working with a laboratory, it's important that the laboratory understands the background of the client. So if you instruct FTS, as I've said, we do a full 40-minute interview of the client and we ask specifically all these questions related to what they do to the hair. So we ask everything about which shampoo they use, how often they use it, what shampoo brand, how much time do they spend in the sun, do they use sunbeds, do they use hair treatments, do they use hair straighteners. We have all this information, so we can then make a pretty good view of how relevant ETG is, and then we would have a profile of that particular person and what ETG results we would expect depending on what their profile is related to, what damage, if you like, has occurred to the hair. So as with drugs, previous excessive drinking can influence levels in hair samples collected a few or several months after drinking has stopped from carryover in dormant hair. So again, just make sure the lab that you're working with understands. It's called telogen hair. It's still on the scalp, but it's dead hair. It's not being fed by the blood supply anymore. So again, the amount of telogen hair is particularly more relevant for Afro-Caribbeans if they have braided hair and the hair's been held together for a long time, which sometimes it is. Then there'll be a lot of dead or telogen hair within that sample. So again, without understanding the background of the client, and if you know that the hair's been braided, how long it's been held together, you then get a good indication of what this carryover of dormant hair is, because the levels in the carryover hair, the dormant hair, might have been from 2 years ago, not the period that you're looking for in this instance. So again, you have to bear that in mind. So ETG can be removed. Dye particularly will remove a proportion of incorporated compounds such as ETG. The most corrosive is bleach, the most significant the removal. So the outcome, if somebody is using bleach, there's a decrease, sometimes a massive decrease in ETG due to the removal of these substances in the hair. And some sections will have multiple treatments. So if the hair's long and they have dyed their hair on multiple occasions, then that's going to have an exponential effect on the level of ETG in a hair sample. So again, consider nails and also consider the use of PEth to give you an alternative view. Pregnancy can affect ETG as well, especially in the third trimester. So again, understanding the background to the client is of particular importance, especially if they are pregnant. So in the third trimester, the baby's liver begins to metabolize compounds in addition to the mother due to the elimination of waste products by and into the placenta or the fetus. So the little baby that's contained in the body will start to take a proportion of alcohol that is processed by the mother, which then doesn't end up in the hair of the mother. So this needs to be factored in. So again, there could be a decrease in levels of ETG due to the existence of the other person inside the body that's taking the alcohol, and the system is breaking that down as the mother's body would as well. So again, impacts will affect a 3-month period. So the third trimester, if that's covered as part of the instruction period, then again, that has to be known and we have to factor that in. So if ETG is problematic for whatever reason, the other option is ETPA, a little bit more stable. It's a fatty acid which is secreted onto the scalp, which has been present in the blood. It's produced when alcohol enters the bloodstream or when alcohol is on the scalp. So, considerations you need to look at for ETPA. Some alcohol-containing hairsprays can affect it. Some perfumes and certain shampoos and conditioners can increase levels of ETPA on the scalp. So again, you have to understand the background of the client, and part of our client questionnaire, we specifically ask these questions so that we get a good understanding of what levels of ETPA we can expect. But ETPA is less susceptible to the removal by dye and bleach, although it is removed particularly when treatments are regular and hair is damaged. So the result can also be understated if it's not considered as well. So again, understanding the background of the client is very important. High pH shampoos, Head and Shoulders as an example, can reduce levels of ETPA and also understate the result because labs often use alcohol as a way of stripping out content of hair. So Head and Shoulders, for instance, might have a level of alcohol as such to start to reduce levels of ETPA in the hair, especially if it's used regularly. There's a different profile to ETG as well. The way it sits on hair is different. So again, labs need to understand this, and you sort of need to have a bit of an understanding of how ETPA works. It migrates up the hair shaft away from the scalp, so concentrating in older hair. So levels normalize more quickly than ETG following a period of abstinence. So if somebody stops completely, then you will find that the hair closest to the scalp should have little or no ETPA present whatsoever because it will have migrated down to the end of the hair follicle. So it's a good way, if you're looking for abstinence, it's a good way to understand what that person is presenting with. So ETPA is quite good for that. So we've sort of gone through a number of samples there. Hopefully it's not too technical for you and you've got a better understanding now of what samples to look for. Sometimes it's determined by the court order, but if you've got a bit of freedom to select what samples you're looking for, then you can hopefully have a better understanding now of what you ask us or the laboratory to samples to collect and how to analyze those samples and what you would expect to see in the report that you get back. So basically what we all want to establish is clarity and understanding and a fair outcome. So if somebody has changed their ways and they were drinking excessively and they have stopped or they've reduced drastically, you need to know this, and the evidence needs to be able to recognize that this has happened. So hair strand testing is reliable. It's really the only way of establishing a longer pattern. And it really is the only way to get a longer period. It can confirm substance presence, identity, and quantify substance concentrations, and test results can be considered as factual evidence. Just bear in mind that, again, it is opinion-based evidence. The numbers and the information coming out of the lab is obviously factual, but unless you know the background of the client and their circumstances, the opinion formed is then an opinion based on what those results actually mean in relation to what's happened to that hair strand before it was analysed. So again, it's opinion-based evidence. It's not factual. It should be treated as factual. And if you've got your client saying one thing and you have a result from a lab that says another, don't always automatically assume there's 100% correct because, well, it's the science and it's the lab, so it must be correct. It's not true. It's an interpretation of a laboratory result. So that's quite important to remember. Present the process used to interpret results can give you misleading reports. So again, even if you understand up to a certain extent what samples you're looking for and what that might give you, for instance, PEth, then if the report from the lab is not clear, it's not really your job to start to interpret these reports. You should obviously go back to the lab, whoever you're using, and ask them to clarify if there's anything misleading in the report. And again, oversimplification of interpretation. If cutoffs are used, that's an oversimplification. If it's below a cutoff, they decide it's passive exposure and not to be needed. Or if it's above a cutoff, then it can be chronic use and you need to make decisions based on that. You don't want to really be in a situation where the evidence that you have in front of you is too binary. Using the words positive and negative don't really help because they're not, doesn't give you a full picture of what's going on. And this is all that you want. You want clarity in terms of, if you're having to have difficult conversations with people, you want to have the evidence in front of you that's robust and gives you that information to enable you to have these proper conversations and clarity within your conversations. Because at the end of the day, if you're going through the court process and it's part of a case that may or may not go into proceedings, what you're looking at is, on the balance of probabilities, what is the situation that we're looking at? And or have they made a change? So if the person that you're representing has decided this is very serious, I need to reduce my alcohol consumption drastically, and they do it, bear in mind that's no mean feat, it's a massive undertaking. You need to be able to demonstrate through your final report and the lab that you're using that this has happened, and you can clearly show this. So it supports, it gains trust with the client, and you're able to support what they're doing. If you're unable to do that, or if there's a binary cut-off showing positive, negative, it might not show what it is that your client has actually committed to do. So that's very important. So as I say in various webinars, if you've heard me speak before, what we do is only one piece of a large jigsaw. There's many other factors that you consider, but one of those might be a hair strand test report for alcohol. And if it's significant, you might, or the local authority or yourself might make life-changing decisions based on that information. So although it's only a small piece of a large and complex jigsaw, it can be quite pivotal in terms of decisions that are being made. So, in our view, and hopefully you will agree, it has to be done properly, it has to be done correct, and it has to consider all the factors in relation to the sample that's being collected, the donor, and what their circumstances are. So we've seen what samples you can take. There's lots of factors that can influence biomarkers, especially in hair, because it grows outside the body. It's open to contamination from the environment. We know that, for instance, because as the body's excreting this toxin, this alcohol, large part of it will come out through sweat. So if you have someone that maybe lives with, if they don't use alcohol excessively themselves, they might live with someone that uses alcohol excessively. They might know it, they might not. But again, there's a lot of close contact, sharing of towels, sharing of soft furnishings, hats, caps. So there could be a lot of cross-contamination through sweat, and this has to be factored in. So if you're working with a laboratory to do this, especially for alcohol, you have to understand, and the laboratory has to understand all the underlying influencing factors, not only what's going on with the client, but where they live, who they live with, who they associate with, where they work could be a factor as well. For instance, if they work in a pub or a nightclub and there's a lot of alcohol around anyway, then that needs to be considered. So case context, very important. The chain of evidence is equally important. How the sample was collected. Have you got photographic evidence, especially if you're collecting hair and nails, that you can rely on if that's ever questioned? And you, rather than relying on a binary, for instance, Society of Hair Testing cutoff, you want to be in a situation where you're getting expert opinion and an expert opinion report from a reporting scientist or a reporting toxicologist that has access to all the information that's relevant to not only what the laboratory's found, but the circumstances of the client and their background. So really what you're looking for is a very comprehensive report. And companies like us, like FTS, because we've been doing millions of tests over many years, we have what's called comparable data. We have profiles of hundreds of thousands of people that are in various situations. So if we're presented with an instruction from a client and we know their profile, for instance, if they say, yeah, I only drink at the weekend when the kids are not with me, so it's not a problem, is it? And you want to try and establish, well, is he telling the truth? Is that a fair assumption? So we have profiles of people that have told us this, and what we have found is back that up. So when we test someone and their profile doesn't match what they're telling us, what they have declared, then we will come back to you and say, what we have found does not match what they have declared to us. So there's a good indication that they're not really telling the truth to us and to you. Conversely, if the person that realizes how critical this situation is and they do make a change, so if they say to us, yeah, I was drinking a bottle of vodka every night and a couple of pints over the weekend, but I have stopped, and I stopped from this date, then if we see that, if that's evident in the samples we collect and the analysis that the lab does, the report that comes back to you will say, what we have found is consistent with what they have told us. So they're probably telling the truth. So again, that's very powerful for you. You will know that they're committed to whatever it is that you're asking them to do. They've made a commitment, and you can demonstrate that through the evidence that you present back to them. So that's very important, that. So I've talked about cutoff levels. You might have seen other webinars where we talk about this in more detail. It's relevant to alcohol testing as well. Many laboratories still use cutoff levels that were introduced 25, 30 years ago. They were an attempt to provide some guidance then. They weren't really that accurate then, but now, because of the way what people do to their hair and the way the laboratories have become more sensitive and specific, they're not really relevant anymore. So if you're using a laboratory that provides what's called a certificate of analysis, and it uses words like positive and negative detected. They're using this process, and you may have seen court guidance that specifically says that if you're working with a laboratory, you need to work with a laboratory that reports all the findings. Everything that they can see is reported back to you, and they have a full understanding of the context of the case and the background of the client. So using a cutoff is an oversimplification of how to report this information. It's very binary, doesn't really help you. Positive and negative doesn't help. You're not trying to catch anybody out. You're trying to support them. And in terms of understanding what the balance of probability is and what's going on, if they have reduced or if they haven't, it's a much more nuanced process that takes a lot more information into consideration than just is it above this cutoff or not. So just bear that in mind. And humans, us, have many variations. So not just the way we metabolize substances, but because of the external environment and where we live and who we associate with, all these have an effect on what levels of alcohol you will see present in any given sample. So you can't just take a sample, run it through some machines in a lab, and give you a certificate with some numbers on. It doesn't really give you the full picture. So coming to the end, we're not far off now. Hope you've enjoyed what I've been talking about. So you were sort of looking for direct biomarkers here, and there's different periods. So get to understand what the different periods are. ETG in hair, ETG in nails, ETG in urine, PEth, what that can give you. These are very reliable. So in most instances, if you're able to instruct for ETG and PEth, and maybe ETPA as well, that will give you a very good indication of what's going on with the person. Try and avoid defined cutoff levels, society for testing cutoff, for instance. Influences can reduce, segmentation isolates, and PEth eliminates as well. So understand what limitations are around what it is that you're asking for and what it is that you're asking the laboratory to look at. And then understand the sample types as well. I've gone through them in a little bit of detail in this webinar, but try and get to understand them a bit more, especially if you're instructing quite regularly for alcohol, and especially if you may have to appear in court or defend this evidence that you have in front of you. Get to understand the sample types and the influences and what should be considered when someone like us or a lab is interpreting all these biomarkers. And we must all consider the context. The evidence provided by the result must be considered in context with the biomarkers windows. You know, are we looking at blood, short window, or are we looking at hair, a long window of detection? The tested individuals self-reported. You know, if you're working with a laboratory and if they ask for a self-reported account, that's very, very helpful to you. And as I've said before, it can be the difference between, yes, we know you're making a commitment to change, and we can see that with the evidence that we've got back from the laboratory that we're using. And then just understand the background of the client as well. You might know your clients very well. If you're from a social background, you may have met them, you may have been to see them in the home, so you may understand more so than maybe a lawyer or legal team, because they might not have met the person in question. And if you get a result back from a laboratory and it doesn't really match with what you think is going on, then that puts you in a difficult situation. And again, if the client's saying one thing and you're saying, yeah, but the lab says this, and it's the lab, so it must be true. So just bear that in mind. Bear in mind that it is opinion-based evidence, and you need to be very careful in terms of making big decisions, important decisions, you know, based on, especially if you're using a laboratory with a society for testing cutoff, because they probably won't have done the additional work to understand the client's background and to understand that the lab has probably identified things below the cutoff that they just don't report to you. So that's the end of this webinar, this presentation. I hope you enjoyed that. If you want to know a bit more about us, or if you want to get in touch, scan that QR code there. We're delighted to answer any questions. You can give us a ring, you can drop us an email if you think of anything that's relevant to what we've gone through here, then just let us know and we'll answer that question for you. But I hope you enjoyed that, and thank you for your time, and watch out for other webinars that we will be producing that are relevant to what you do in your everyday jobs. So thank you, everyone.